And now to present Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky, the birth of the Pan American Clippers, please welcome Mr. Sergei Sikorsky.
Thank you for that very, very pleasant introduction. I quite honestly feel a little bit flattered in this group of aviation experts. And I'll tell you one thing. I would say Carol's presentation is a hard act to follow. We are here today to remember a unique friendship that started. But before we do that, I'd like to briefly make a resume of Igor Sikorsky's career in aviation. He started with a love affair for the helicopter. When he was already 17 and 18 years of age, he built 2 helicopters in Russia. We're talking now 1909, 1910. Those 2 helicopters have disappeared. However, his words of wisdom in describing that very early pioneering period probably are worth repeating today. One of the axioms at that time, according to Igor Sikorsky, was that grudgingly, the pilot had, generally speaking, the right to choose when he took off and in what direction he was going to fly. But the landing was always decided by the airplane, not by the pilot. There's also another comment that he made about that time, 1910, which was, and I quote, "We were ignorant, and we were ignorant of the fact that we were ignorant." Now that is ignorance squared, and it can lead to a lot of trouble. And the third comment, of course, was the fact that at that time, well, in fact, if I can go back a little bit, mankind was trying to copy the birds in learning to fly. And it was only until the beginning of the last century that man began to realize that maybe the birds were unique and that mankind would have to start with fixed wing before he could get into flying. All of the birds have been trying to teach mankind for about 1 million years a fundamental fact, a fact that has been known now for some years to helicopter pilots, but unfortunately not to our fixed-wing brothers and sisters. And that fact that the birds have been trying to teach us for about 1 million years is that it is far more intelligent to stop and then land than it is to land and then try to stop. About the turn of the last century, a number of things happened to inspire young Igor Sikorsky, and among them are the rediscovery and the publication of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches, including this sketch of the helicopter. The other event that impacted very strongly on Igor Sikorsky was a publication of a book by a brilliant Frenchman named Jules Verne. And he wrote a book called Rover the Conqueror, in which he describes with uncanny accuracy the characteristics and the uses to which a helicopter could be put to. And in his mind's eye, Igor Sikorsky never forgot that book, and I think that's where the love affair starts, with Igor Sikorsky and the helicopter. Charles Lindbergh was born just about 1 year before the Wright brothers flew, and his impact on aviation, as we know, was tremendous. Igor Sikorsky, some 13 years younger than Lindbergh, spent 2 years trying to develop a helicopter, 1909, 1910, gave it up, went into fixed-wing aircraft, realizing intuitively that possibly the fixed-wing aircraft were easier eventually to design and build than the helicopter. And he was correct in that respect. In 3 short, brilliant years, don't ask me how many crashes later and how many repairs later, he had taught himself how to design and build airplanes, taught himself how to fly these aircraft, and was well on his way to become quite a famous young Russian pilot. His instant claim to fame happened with the design of this, the world's first multi-engine, 4-engined aircraft to fly successfully. It's interesting to note, ladies and gentlemen, that this aircraft flew 9.5 short years after the Wright brothers' flight. And you have to realize how fast aviation started to progress after the Wright brothers had first broken through this wall. To the pilots in this room, he would describe it as a unique aircraft. It took off at 60 miles an hour, it cruised at 60 miles an hour, and it stalled at 60 miles an hour. However, it did win him instant recognition in Europe and led to his first meeting with the Tsar. There they are standing on this open air balcony in front of this flying bridge actually was usable in flight. And Dad would often climb out into this thing, hand the controls over to someone else and just stand there. And at 60 miles an hour, cool in the winter, but very, very pleasant in the summer. This led to the building of a much larger aircraft. And here comes one of the secrets of Igor Sikorsky's career. He was, at that time, building and in production with the world's heaviest aircraft and 4 engines to boot. And the secret of that whole success was something that he intuitively invented himself, namely the very high aspect ratio wing. To the engineers in the room here, that was the secret of this aircraft. It could fly only because of the fact that it had an extremely high aspect ratio wing, long, thin, somewhat like a glider today. The other secret that he kept continuing on with, and I quote this extensively, was, yes, there is a man on the wingtip sitting out there. That was wing walking in 1913, 1914. The other secret was the fact that he intuitively realized on a multi-engined aircraft that you could lose an engine, even the outboard engine, either on the right and on the left. Consequently, these first transports and all of the transports that followed had their vertical rudders towed in, so that if you lost one engine on one side, the drag would start putting you this way. But then if you opened up the throttle and it created a terrific prop wash on the opposite towed-in rudder, that rudder compensated for about 90% of the drag of the one engine out on one side. And that's a secret gimmick that he used with great success throughout most of his other aircraft. The interior of the aircraft were very luxurious by those standards. Yes, there is a hatch, a glass-covered hatch. That was the grid work that was used to navigate and determine drift error in flight. With this aircraft, Igor Sikorsky became instantly famous in Europe when, in the summer of 1914, he made a record-breaking flight. With 4 men on board, they flew in 2 days from St. Petersburg to his home city of Kiev in Russia. And about a week later, after they sobered up from the celebrations, they flew back from Kiev to St. Petersburg, 860 miles, literally in 1 day. They took off in the pre-dawn darkness from Kiev and late that afternoon landed back in St. Petersburg. The flight probably would have gathered quite a few bits of publicity, except for the fact that it was overshadowed because when they landed, they had heard about the assassination in Sarajevo and that World War I started. The aircraft were converted into heavy bombers. Some 72 of them were built. It was the first aircraft in the history of aviation to have up to 6 machine gun positions, and also the first aircraft in aviation history to have a tail gunner's position. With the tragedy of the Russian Revolution, Igor Sikorsky and his friendship with the Tsar were well known to the Bolshevik revolutionaries, and Igor Sikorsky left Russia with a threat of instant arrest and execution if he stayed there any longer. Life started very difficult for Mr. Sikorsky in America. Actually, the first factory was a chicken coop owned by a fellow white Russian refugee just next to Roosevelt Field, Long Island. At a critical moment in time, they ran out of money, and it was then that a gentleman came along, totally unexpectedly. And if any of you here are lovers of classical music, I think you will realize the man that came, looked at that airplane, sat down and wrote out a check for $5,000. And this is the beginning of Sikorsky aircraft. The check was signed Sergei Rachmaninoff. And it was the pianist and composer, Sergei Rachmaninoff, that gave Dad a loan of $5,000 to start work. The aircraft eventually was sold to a number of people. Roscoe Turner flew it around the United States for a number of years and eventually sold it to a young gentleman named Howard Hughes, who used it during the filming of an aviation epic called Hell's Angels. It's about that same period of time, interestingly, coincidentally, that Hell's Angels is being filmed, that a young gentleman named Charles Lindbergh begins to dream of snatching the Orteig Prize, $25,000, for the first crossing of the Atlantic from New York to Paris, or from Paris back to New York. When Charles Lindbergh made his flight across the ocean, in my father's words, before Lindbergh's flight, aviation was a hobby for rich playboys. After Charles Lindbergh's flight, aviation became a profession. It's also interesting to note to me, coincidentally, that Igor Sikorsky made his historical flight, 850 miles, from St. Petersburg to Kiev and back again at the age of 25. Charles Lindbergh made his crossing of the Atlantic also at the age of 25. When Charles Lindbergh landed, America became air-minded overnight. Sikorsky was fortunate in that it had the prototype of a small twin-engined amphibian. And yes, the aircraft, interestingly enough, had one capability: flight with one engine out. Because of the fact that, because of the wing design and the very high aspect ratio of the wing, the airplane could fly on 280 horsepower. It had a Pratt & Whitney of 400 horsepower. So to demonstrate it, on one or two occasions, Dad would simply, he was the demo pilot at that time, he would purposely taxi out and then shut down one engine and take off with one engine and fly around Roosevelt Field and then eventually land with that engine. Charles Lindbergh flew in the S-38 with Igor Sikorsky as a safety pilot. Lindbergh came back, went to Juan Trippe, and said to him, "You hired me as a technical consultant. I can tell you I have just flown the aircraft that you need to start operation in the Caribbean, the S-38. And here's Charles Lindbergh starting the first of the airmail runs from from Miami to Dinner Key, from Dinner Key down the Caribbean islands, and eventually to the Panama Canal. And that was how Pan American began to make its money and also to establish its routes with the S-38. Everywhere that Lindbergh went, he officially had to make a speech promoting aviation and also promoting Pan American Airways, which he did extremely well. Trippe was very, very happy with this arrangement because of the fact that anywheres and everywheres where Charles Lindbergh landed, there would always be crowds and newspaper headlines, and they helped Pan American Airways. Pan Am also had some other interesting, intriguing technologies for staying alive. In those days, the airlines made very little money on passengers because there were very few passengers. However, their main source of income were the airmail contracts. These airmail contracts were, generally speaking, you were paid for the amount of airmail that you carried. The sacks were weighed and you were given a certain amount, X dollars per mile, to carry the mail. And it is a well-known fact, possibly revealed for the first time today, that an enterprising Pan American station manager took a vacation to New York where he bought about 30 to 50 New York telephone books. And the Pan American station managers began to send these New York telephone books to each other via the airmail system, which boosted revenues very, very significantly. It's about that same time that Charles Lindbergh and Juan Trippe made a lightning tour of South America. And thanks to the skill of Charles Lindbergh and the relative speed of the S-38, he was able to visit some 16 governments in the Caribbean and South America, 16 government heads in 20 days of actual calendar time. And with that whirlwind tour, he signed up the airmail rights to 3/4 of the Caribbean and ensured the success of Pan American Airways. One of the great reasons for it, this is a rather fuzzy photograph, and I'm afraid it's not very visible. It's dawn, and here are a couple of S-38 Pan American aircraft on the beach. No hangars, no runways, no ramps. They're on the beach because of the fact that this hard sand beach was good enough to be used as an air base. This was one of the tremendous advantages of the amphibian because it allowed Pan Am to go in and land, because most of the important cities and most of the important towns were located on the waterfronts or on the rivers or on lakes. This is also part of the typical scenery of this is, in fact, I think, the prototype for what would later become the Pan American Clipper Club. The production of the S-38 continued apace, despite the impact of the American Depression. Pan American believed in it. Charles Lindbergh believed in Igor Sikorsky, and there came a very interesting thing. 2 short months after the stock market crash of 1929, Pan American came to Igor Sikorsky and said, "We want you to build a large 36 to 40 passenger aircraft capable of a range of at least 300, preferably 500 miles." The first sketches were done using the S-38 as a sort of basic model. In other words, just take the S-38, make it twice as big, and it should do the job. It's about the same time that Charles Lindbergh made the first of his reconnaissance flights across the Pacific, the North Pacific. If you take a look at it, if you take a look out on Mercator, it's rather crooked. However, if you take a look at it as a great circle route, you see how logical the film was. And I'm here at this moment deeply indebted to a gentleman that will speak later this afternoon, Mr. Davies, and I thank you, sir, for the possibility of using these slides. This is all the work and the research of Mr. Davies himself. The aircraft in its preliminary sketches is very interesting because it is a direct outgrowth of the S-38. Something occurred during the engineering discussions, which Dad, with a twinkle in his eye, would later on say, it got to be very mysterious because every time we went down to New York with sketches and proposals for the S-40, the one thing that Charles Lindbergh would complain about would be the position of the pilot. And after every conference, the pilot's cabin would move forward a few inches. And probably by the 12th conference, as they had everything lined up, the cockpit was there where Charles Lindbergh wanted it in the first place, namely right up in front there. When this aircraft was built, it was the largest aircraft ever manufactured at that time in the United States, carrying some 36 to 40 passengers, cruising at about 105 to 110 miles an hour, and it became literally the flagship. One of the requirements was comfort, because the aircraft was destined to carry the heavy rollers, the very wealthy, that at that time were taking railway club cars, going down all from the United States to Miami, and then from Dinner Key, they would fly to Havana. Havana at that time was full of A, beautiful women, B, a lot of booze, and C, a lot of gambling. It was the Las Vegas of the 1930s. As the aircraft began to go through its flight test work, Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky could report with great satisfaction that it had met and or exceeded all of the requirements laid down by Pan American Airways. It flew on its inaugural flight from Stratford, Connecticut, across New York, eventually to Washington, where this Sikorsky was the first aircraft to carry the name Clipper. The S-40s were, the 3 aircraft were built, and these were the first of what Pan American would call the Clipper ships. On the flight, during that flight, Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky begin to sit down using menus, envelopes, and pieces of paper, and they sketch out what will be the next airplane. It was interesting because it was a very, very speculative thing to try to design an airplane capable of flying at least 1,200 miles, if possible with less passengers and more fuel, to be able to go 2,500 miles, that magic number between San Francisco and the Hawaiian Islands. This sketch, by the way, is in Charles Lindbergh's own handwriting, and it gives the distances that are required to fly from New York to Newfoundland, and then either to London or to Paris. As the sketches progressed, the Lindberghs left on another great expedition, again, very accurately described by Mr. Davies' chart, where they traveled across the North Atlantic, visiting a number of European countries, eventually working their way south to North Africa, and from Bathurst across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what is important in this sketch and the trip was the fact that the Lindberghs kept an precise, perfect description of the landing fields, whether they be lakes or rivers or on land. They described their local terrain, and they made notes of prevailing winds and prevailing currents and things of that sort. This was, in effect, the first of what you might call the Jepson manuals. But it put Pan American in a commanding position because there was no airline at that time, certainly not in the United States, that had the detailed description of every available major landing field, either for flying boats or for land planes. The Lindberghs literally created a logbook that would very shortly become critically important to Pan Am at the beginning of World War II. When the S-42 was rolled out, the child of Charles Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky, it had a number of very, very interesting characteristics to it, including tightly cowled engines, for the first time constant speed propellers, hydraulically controllable. When the aircraft began to perform during its test flights, both Lindbergh and Dad were very, very pleased with it. It had, during its day, that fairly streamlined, when you think of it as a 1933 aircraft. This is a pretty streamlined little bird. The wing is mounted on top of the fuselage, well away from the fuselage, so you don't have the wing root fuselage interference and drag. It's a pure, beautiful elliptical wing. And again, if you take a look at it, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but if you take a look at that wing, you see a perfectly beautiful elliptical main lifting surface, of course, in square, and then elliptical wings tapering off to minimize the drag, and an aspect ratio of, believe it or not, of 10.8. With this combination of beautifully tapered wing, some other aerodynamics that I can go to in detail if you are interested later on, it matched the FAA requirements. Now, the FAA had, in those days, a very quaint idea that the landing speed of an airplane that carried passengers cannot exceed 65 miles an hour, because it is a medical fact there is no pilot that can land an airplane going faster than 65 miles an hour. His reflexes just aren't there, and his eyesight just isn't there. Well, I wouldn't laugh, because there are a couple of pilots like that, including your speaker. But at any rate, the Sikorsky S-42 was capable of, thanks to that giant flap that you see here, was capable of being landed at 62 miles an hour, and it fulfilled the requirements of the thing. The other thing interesting about it was, if you took a look at it, that beautiful wing, when the aircraft was designed, both Lindbergh and Igor Sikorsky knew that it could not pass the FAA requirements, because at that time the FAA had a mandatory maximum wing loading of something like 18 pounds per square inch. This aircraft, the S-42, with the flaps retracted, had a wing loading of 30 pounds per square foot, nearly twice the maximum that was allowable by the FAA. This heavy wing loading at that time was surprising because when you consider within a few weeks of the introduction of the S-42, Boeing introduced their little pea shooter. Remember the 26th, the little fighter? And it's interesting to note that the little pea shooter at that time, the P-26, was considered the hottest thing flying in the United States and certainly in the world. And it had a wing loading of 22 pounds per square foot, and this aircraft already had 30 pounds per square foot. At any rate, the FAA, with great astonishment, found that the aircraft was capable of being landed at 65 miles an hour and proceeded to bless it. It was in that summer of 1932 and 1933, rather, that the aircraft established a number of world's records on one flight, establishing 8 world's records for range, payload, and cruising speed. And I think you can see here in this photograph the pride of Charles Lindbergh and of Igor Sikorsky, because after that one flight in which they established 8 world's records, literally they had moved America from 3rd place to 1st place in the number of world records of aviation. The airplane went on an inaugural tour throughout all of South America, creating a sensation because of its cruising speed and also because of the number of passengers that it carried. And the passengers began to beat down the doors of the local Pan American offices when they learned that there was a chance that once in a while that there'd be Charles Lindbergh on board to fly them around the South American continent. And here you see one of these things where I'm confident at least 2 of those girls were determined to take Charles home as a souvenir of the flight. To put this in context, the S-42 and the DC-2, DC-3 series were put into service at just about the same time. Interesting enough, without in any way knocking the DC-3, the S-42 was capable of carrying twice the number of passengers, twice the distance of the DC-3, and in fact was able to outperform the DC-3 on almost any route in the world, as long as it had water. We are all familiar with this photograph of the S-42 leaving on its survey flights across the Pacific Ocean, and eventually making it on that first flight to Honolulu, then turned around, and eventually would go out to Wake, eventually would go out to Midway, eventually wind up in Manila, and from Manila, spur line led to Hong Kong, and another one led to Auckland, New Zealand. These are the routes that were pioneered by S-42s. I must say, very, very honestly, that these were done with specially modified S-42s. The others were kept on passenger-carrying service. 2 of these boats, for a while, were modified. Passenger cabin taken out and long-range tanks put in so as to arrive at that long range that was required to survey the Pacific Ocean, and eventually, later on, to survey the North Atlantic as well. It was about that time, in 1938, that Charles Lindbergh began to write to his very good friend, Igor Sikorsky, warning him that the era of the big flying boats was coming to an end, and that there were aircraft being designed by Lockheed, by Douglas, that probably large four-engined land planes that would eventually take the place of the flying boat. Charles Lindbergh was advising his good friend, Igor Sikorsky, to go into the fixed-wing transport business. In other words, to start a competition with Douglas and with Boeing. Dad chose a different route and returned to his first love, the helicopter, which lifted off in 1939. I think I can only say his words, that this was a wonderful way of repeating one's life all over again, to design a new kind of flying machine without knowing how to design it, build it without knowing quite how to build it, and then test flying it, and you've never flown a helicopter before in your life. So that obviously to the technical gentlemen and ladies in this room, I would say the envelope expansion was very, very minimal at first. But within a few years, the aircraft became a success. Simultaneously with the start of World War II, Charles Lindbergh volunteered and eventually ended up as a tech rep, flying and instructing US Navy, Marine, and US Air Force pilots primarily on cruise control techniques. That man revolutionized a great many military operational tendencies by being able to show them reducing manifold pressure, RPM, increasing pitch. At any rate, he was able to, without any modification to the fuel system, to increase the range of fighter aircraft by 15 and 20%. He, during the war, continued to follow the progress of the VS-300 and later on the production helicopters that followed. And both men were very, very pleased when the first of the long life-saving flights began to take place by helicopter. The first one in the CBI Theater in May of 1945, when a crashed airplane, the crew of a crashed airplane, were evacuated from deep in Japanese territory by a very, very courageous pilot flying the R-4 to an airstrip, to a clearing that had been prepared by, if any of you remember the name, the Merrill's Marauders. With the end of the war, Charles Lindbergh returned home. With the end of the war, the helicopters continued in production and continued to save human lives. Nearing the end of my presentation, I would say that Charles Lindbergh had a tremendous impact on aviation, as we all know. Both men, Igor Sikorsky and Charles Lindbergh, would go on to be honored by their peers. Both of them received the Wright Brothers Trophy on different dates, and also on different dates, both of these men received the Collier Trophy. It's interesting to note that in 1954, Secretary of the Air Force, Mr. Talbot, asked his staff, I am resigning as Secretary of the Air Force, but I'd like to leave with a flourish. Can you gentlemen think of anything that would be something that the Air Force would approve, something that the America would approve of? In his staff at that time was a gentleman named Robert Scott. Bob Scott is known to many of you in this room as a flying tiger, and many of you have read his book, God is My Co-Pilot. And it was Bob Scott that stood up, all 6'2" of him, and said, Mr. Secretary, it's goddamn simple. Now, this is an Alabama dialect, which I will not capable of reproducing. There's a great man who made the greatest single flight ever made in the world. He was a colonel in the Air Force Reserves. He had to resign because of the fact that he offended President Roosevelt by telling President Roosevelt the truth about the airmail fiasco when the Army was forced to start flying the airmail, and then told him the truth of the fact that the Nazis were well ahead of Europe in aircraft and in air power. All you gotta do, Mr. Secretary, is to make him a general. And it's interesting that on April of 1954, President Eisenhower signed a presidential decree reinstating Charles Lindbergh in the United States Air Force and awarding him the rank of Brigadier General. And it is also a documented fact that during that ceremony, as he signed off on the bill, and I can quote President Eisenhower saying, as President of the United States, I have signed many bills. None have given me greater pleasure than this one. In conclusion, I would like to say that it is fair to say that both of these men, working together, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern, long-range, high-speed, multi-engine transport. Both men, I'm proud to say, served their country and served it well. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A postscript. I threw this photograph in at the last minute. As you know, Charles Lindbergh was not a great lover of photography and certainly did not willingly pose for photographs. This photograph is not from a press photographer. This is a very relaxed Lindbergh in the cockpit of the S-42, and it was taken by his good friend, Igor Sikorsky. And thank you once again.
In 1927, my mother and I were downtown Oakland, and after Charles Lindbergh had made his flights to Paris, he was making a tour of the United States. He took off from Oakland, flew directly over the corner of, the southeast corner of 12th and Broadway. And when he came over, there was a man that got up on the flagpole and installed an eagle. Now this eagle is not a sitting eagle, it's a flying eagle. And I've researched the papers of that year and I can't find anything about it. So if someone would be able to acknowledge or to verify the fact that what I saw actually happened. Is there any evidence of that eagle being put up on that day?
I think probably if you saw it, probably someone else saw it.
What's with your dad's hats?
That's the subject of as many aviation legends grow. We don't know where the thing grew. He did wear a fedora on many of his test flights, and as you can probably see from the photographs, immaculately dressed, even with a necktie and all that good stuff, because he was from the old school. In Europe, you got dressed up to go flying, even if you were a test pilot. The fedora somehow gained the reputation of being a good luck charm. That is, if you, as a helicopter pilot, put that hat on, even for a second, no helicopter would ever hurt you. And I think it started along the Marines. The hat, by the way, yes, is still alive and well, now preserved in a glass case at the Sikorsky archives.
Are there any examples of Sikorsky flying boat in existence today?
Yes, there are several examples. There is, okay, from the point of view of the calendar, there are two beautiful replicas of the S-38. One built by Sam Johnson of the Johnson Wax people, and another one by Buzz Kaplan, who passed away recently. In fact, both gentlemen have passed away recently, but Buzz had a very wonderful little restoration facility, BAR, Born Again Restorations. And they built two S-38s, and I had the privilege and the honor and the very emotional experience of repeating my childhood flight when a year and a half ago I flew in Buzz Kaplan's S-38 and we shot a couple of landings on a lake near Phoenix, Arizona. So yeah, that brought back memories. There is also the two S-38s, and there is one S-43 in Texas that was owned by Howard Hughes. And that aircraft is still alive and well in a hangar in Texas, but unfortunately its certificate has expired, and the gentleman that owns it doesn't have quite enough money to get it back into the air. We're hoping that he'll see his way clear to selling it and restoring it. And in the museum in New England, Air Museum, Hartford, Connecticut, is the last surviving flying boat of that era. There are no more Boeings, there are no more Martins, but there is one Sikorsky S-44, the Excalibur, that is still alive and well. It'll never fly again, but it's in perfect condition in a museum up there near Harvard.
Was that S-44, was that owned by Captain Charles Blair and used down there in the Caribbean?
Antilles airboats.
Yeah, this is exactly, to answer the question, this S-44 was owned by Charlie Blair and Maureen O'Hara, his wife, who flew it. Antilles Airboats was the airline that he had. And that 44 did some very, very fine work. Eventually, through a mistake, landing on a reef which you don't do with flying boats. At any rate, it was then put ashore, and through a number of circumstances, eventually ended up at Sikorsky Aircraft, where we restored it and put it in the New England Air Museum.
It was also operated by Catalina Airways.
Sir? Oh, yes, I forgot, pardon me, I forgot to say also that it was operated by Catalina Catalina? Avalon, yeah. It was operated between Los Angeles and Catalina Islands. So there's one over here.
Wasn't there a S-48?
The S-44.
Did you build an S-48?
S-48? The S-48 was a paper project, never got S-45 or 46, 47. Oh, pardon me, okay. The numerical line, the S-48, is also known as the H-5 and R-5. Yes?
The S-44 started life with American Export flying the Atlantic during the war.
Yes. The gentleman that will be speaking to you later this afternoon, Mr. Davies, noted the fact correctly that the S-44 series, the Excalibur series, was flown across the ocean, and in fact one or two of them have at that time performed spectacular supply flights during World War II, carrying blood plasma and nurses across the Atlantic to, I think, Casablanca. Yes.
It seems that up until this aircraft was transferred, all the flying boats had the wings suspended, elevated above the fuselage on structural fishes. You know what caused him to decide to repair the fuselage, in this case, instead of wing? Was it for more space, or was it for better drag?
I don't know. I think you'd probably have to ask Mr. Glenn Martin by way of a Ouija board for that answer. But yeah, there was a trend to try to meld the wing into the fuselage. But it's still interesting to note that the two aircraft that very successfully had the wing mounted above the fuselage, and both of them with a fairly heavy aspect ratio, were the immortal Catalina PBY series. And I spent some time in the turret of that PBY during World War II as a flight eng. And the other one, of course, was the S-42. The reason for both being up on a cabane strut, in fact, on top of the wing, was to avoid that interference, the aerodynamic interference between the wing root and fuselage joints. By passing, it's also interesting to note that the one aircraft that got away with it, because aerodynamically, if you can make the wing stick out at 90 degrees from the, in other words, the clean brake, you will not have that turbulence problem. And the only aircraft that did that successfully was the Corsair, where the wing came right out at 90 degrees to the center line. Yes, sir.
I guess as a follow-up to the question the gentleman in the first row asked, why was there never more of an effort to preserve transport or transport to?
The question was, why were there not any more efforts to conserve any one of these aircraft? Unfortunately, let's see. Two of the three S-43s remained at the property of the United States Navy. They were taken over by the Navy during World War II. Pan Am operated them for the Navy as navigational trainers. After the end of the war, the Navy decided they didn't have the money to maintain them, so they scrapped two of them. One returned back to Pan American Airways, was stripped of all the passenger fittings, and a reinforced floor put in. It is arguably the first air freighter in the history of aviation, the first dedicated air freight machine. Of the 10 roughly S-42s that were built after the end of World War II, all of them were scrapped by Pan Am. Nobody realized the historical impact of these aircraft at that time.
In the movie The Aviator, there's a small amphibious boat in there on the coast of land as well.
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, in the movie The Aviator, one about Howard Hughes, there's a flying boat in that, not the Spruce Goose, but a very small one. It's amphibious, and they show
Yeah.
him flying up into.
Well, there's this famous scene where he flies, lands on the beach, and walks up and starts flirting with Katharine Hepburn. The reality was that Howard Hughes did not own, at all in his life, did not own an S-38, which is the one that was used. That, by the way, was Buzz Kaplan's replica that was chartered for the film. He did have an S-43, and that's the one that he flew Katharine Hepburn around over, twilight flight over Hollywood. But he never owned an S-38.
Can I ask you a comment about how your father created or invented these aircraft? Was he sort of an absent-minded type that would come to him in a burst of genius, or was it a slow process, or what was the sort of creative
You talking about Howard Hughes?
No. Your father, the aircraft he created, what was the process?
Well, I can say it this way, maybe. First of all, very strong believer in large aircraft. Very strong believer in high aspect ratio wings, despite the fact that they're more difficult to build, far more difficult to stress, and require more struts. But the trade-off always proved him right. As far as design work goes, I would say it this way. He was very enthusiastically responsive to the requirements as laid down by Charles Lindbergh, by Juan Trippe, and also by Andre Priester of Pan Am. And Pan Am at that time was the airline that made you sit up and take notice, and also the one that had the toughest requirements. But he kept coming back. The other characteristics is stubbornness. A very gentle, very wonderfully stubborn person who would have a challenge thrown at him and work on it for a while. One of his colleagues described it as a dog chewing on a big, thick bone, and he just can't get through to it. So he lays the bone aside for about 2 or 3 days, then comes back and chews on it some more, and then lays it down, chews on it, and maybe 6 months later, he finally gets to crack that bone open. And that was Dad with the helicopter. That was Dad with the flying boats. He had this determination. Once he accepted the challenge, or once he felt that there was a challenge that needed a solution, he would work on it, sometimes literally 2, 3, 4 years. In the case of the helicopter, 30 years later, he came back to do it.
Can you tell me how he became involved?
Both men knew of the existence of the other. One knew of the existence of the other. However, they didn't meet until it was 1925, when the first Sikorsky airplane to be built in the United States was nearly completed. And there are a number of versions of it, but at any rate, the one version that I know that my father told me is that without any announcement, one afternoon, on a Saturday afternoon, great big chauffeur-driven car drove up, and out stepped a man. And the man was immediately recognized by this tiny little group of refugees as the one and only, Sergei Rachmaninoff. But if you remember that all of these were 6 or 8 white Russian officers all working together, and it's an old Russian custom that you do not address a person by his name until you have been formally introduced by a third person. So it's yes sir, no sir, yes sir, no sir. And however, they did meet there in the chicken coop. That same afternoon, Rachmaninoff chatted with my father and eventually signed the check for $5,000. And to further reinforce the effect, accepted the title of honorary vice president of Sikorsky Aircraft, which he kept for about 6 years. But they met purely as a happenstance, or at the desire and at the interest of Rachmaninoff. They stayed close friends. I do remember a number of meetings where Rachmaninoff would come to our house in Connecticut and spend hours chatting with Dad about anything and everything in the world. It was a bit of an interesting sensation, and also the one other name that I can probably flash right now at you was a delightful gentleman a violinist named Yehudi Menuhin. And Yehudi Menuhin also was a close friend of Dad's, and very often, it was surprising, Yehudi often said that he was a frustrated pilot or a frustrated aeronautical engineer. His dad had taught him the violin and forced him to become, of course, a great violinist. But Menuhin was his heart, somewhere in his heart, he had this great big lump for aeronautical engineering and for aircraft. And one thing you can say, I was present at some of these meetings, and Yehudi was asking some pretty, how should we put it, sophisticated questions on engineering trade-offs, so that he knew his stuff, not only as a violinist, but also, I think, as an amateur aeronautical engineer.
Did your father refer to his vertical takeoff craft from the very beginning as helicopters? Or did he?
No, always from the beginning. In fact, even the 1910 machines, he always called them helicopters.
You told your dad having any close calls flying?
Excuse me? Say again?
You told him about having any close calls when he was doing all this test flying of helicopters, one thing and another?
You'll have to repeat it once again. I'm not quite sure that I understand the question.
He's asking about any close calls. Your father had any close
Well,
calls?
any close calls when he was flying? Accidents?
A number. Close call number one is 1909, when he was on a demonstration flight at a country fair in Russia and took off, and shortly after takeoff, maybe 20, 30 seconds after takeoff, his engine quit, stone cold, boom, like that. And he purposely crashed it into a railway yard because of the fact that it was either that or go into a cemetery. Cemeteries also, airplanes stumble when they land in cemeteries. So he purposely wrecked it. And he found out later, in examining the aircraft, that somebody had not strained the aviation gas properly, and there was a mosquito lodged in the copper tubing where the tubing made a turn. And that mosquito had been sucked into the fuel system and had plugged it off. That crash was the one that caused him to start looking at the idea of a multi-motored aircraft capable of maintaining flight with one engine out. So somewheres there is an immortal mosquito in mosquito heaven that triggered the multi-engined aircraft. Yeah, he had a number of other crashes. Helicopters, yeah, one rollover accident where it got thrown through the rotor system. There's another, then there's another demonstration. In the morning, practicing for the first public demonstration to the board of directors of United Aircraft. And due to a gust of wind, a very hard landing is made, and about 3 inches of the tail rotor are broken off. So everybody's wondering whether they go and cancel the demonstration. One of Dad's more, how should we put it, elastic engineers runs into the shop, gets a hacksaw, and cuts exactly the same amount off the other tail rotor blade. They paint it up, and sure enough, 2 hours later, they make the flight demonstration rather successfully. You see, there wasn't that much FAA in those days. So. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question was whether my father was the first man to master the squash plate, the cyclic control system. No, he was not. That had been probably done by both Breguet and certainly Professor Henrik Focke in Germany, 1934, 1936. What Igor Sikorsky always insisted on was the fact that he did not invent the helicopter. The helicopter matured literally from the first attempts in 1909, 1910. The first, in Igor Sikorsky's opinion, and I think we can accept it, the first helicopter to fly fully, successfully, without any problems whatsoever, was the German Focke FW-61, the Focke-Wulf machine. However, Igor Sikorsky is famous, and I think justifiably so, for taking all of this earlier work and combining it and building a configuration that everybody considered impossible, namely a single main lifting rotor and a single tail rotor. Everybody else could give you a 2-hour lecture on why the only way to build a helicopter is to have 2 rotors turning in opposite directions to neutralize the torque. And Igor Sikorsky was the first one to realize that properly done, the torque can be mastered with a single tail rotor.
Did your father go on the survey trips?
Say again?
To your right. To your left. To your right. Okay.
Okay.
Did your father ever go on the survey trips on his plane?
Did my father ever?
Go on Pan Am survey trips with his plane?
No, not on the survey trips because of the fact that it was a fairly strong policy of Pan Am that you did not take extra passengers on a survey trip. Dad did go on the inaugural flight of the S-40, several flights with Charles Lindbergh on the S-38, and of course several flights with Lindbergh on the S-42. But these were inaugural flights, these were scheduled passenger flights. But the route surveys, no. That was against Pan Am policy.
Is there a story behind the merger of Sikorsky?
Is there a story behind the merger of Sikorsky? Yeah, very briefly stated, 1937, 1938, war clouds are gathering, and Pratt & Whitney gets a humongous order for engines from the British and from the French. At that time, Chance Watt had its own factory facilities right next door to Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford. When Pratt & Whitney got these huge orders, they made a decision to move Chance Watt down to part of the Sikorsky factory. And when Chance Watt, at that time, prototyping the Corsair, but didn't need really that much floor space. And Igor Sikorsky was finishing the flying boats and just starting with the helicopter. So the two companies melded together. They became, for about 3 years, Sikorsky. The Sikorsky then began to start building up the helicopter production, and of course, Chance Watt building up the Corsair production. So then it was decided to break them apart again, and each received its own factory.